I am truly so humbled and honored to have an opportunity to give this talk today. And of course, with this dissertation work, there were so many different people involved in it, from the teachers and students who gave up precious time to take part in the study, to the many mentors who I've had an opportunity to work with and learn from. This project wouldn't have been possible without their support, so I wanted to be sure to thank and recognize them as well. Today, I'm going to be talking about the work I conducted for my dissertation research, and before I talk about the specifics of that study, I'm going to begin by spending just a few minutes discussing the significance of the broader question and the prior work that inspired it. Assessment is both prevalent and salient in elementary and secondary school classrooms, and as a result, students are constantly confronted with indicators of their academic performance. Grades are the most common indicator, but they're not the only form of feedback that students may receive on assessments. Written comments, for example, may supplement or replace grades, or students may not receive any feedback at all. So especially given the widespread prevalence and salience of assessment and the performance feedback that follows, a clear understanding of how these different forms of performance feedback ultimately influence critical academic outcomes, including student motivation, is of central importance. And in this work, I define performance feedback as performance-specific evaluative information that's conveyed to students on assessments in the form of a grade, a written comment, or a combination of the two. And I define academic motivation broadly as the process whereby academic goal-directed activity is both instigated and sustained. And especially given the timely significance of this issue, it's unsurprising that in recent decades, a growing literature has emerged to investigate the motivational consequences of performance feedback. However, there's been a lot of inconsistent conclusions drawn within this literature. And as a result, in a project that preceded my dissertation work, my colleagues and I conducted several meta-analyses as an attempt to resolve some of the discrepant conclusions in the literature, where we statistically integrated primary study outcomes to investigate the motivational impact of grades on assessments compared to either written comments or no feedback. And this work was an important first step in beginning to clarify some of the confusion in the literature. For example, in a moderator analysis, it was revealed that the motivational impact of written comments on an assessment was more nuanced than a main effect may imply, where students who received only written comments on their assessments experienced huge motivational benefits, with more than an entire standard deviation separating them from their peers who received only grades. However, students who received comments and grades together were no more motivated than their peers who only received grades. So in addition, though, to identifying these types of nuances in the literature and beginning to resolve the confusion within it, another important contribution of this meta-analytic work were the four notable gaps in the extant literature that it identified. Where first, the meta-analysis found that whether performance of feedback effects interacted with the feedback stage remained entirely unexplored. And by feedback stage, what I'm referring to is whether students were merely anticipating feedback or whether they had actually received it. And the importance of this distinction and the question that emerges from it stems from a potential design confound, where the majority of previous studies have investigated the motivational consequences of performance feedback by first experimentally manipulating feedback by randomly assigning students to one of several conditions, then by actually delivering that feedback so that the students receive it, and then by measuring students' motivation. However, this design has been argued to confound the impact of feedback form with the valence or the degree of favorability that's attached to that feedback. For example, two students' motivation may look very different if they both receive grades, but one of those students receives an A and the other one of them receives an F. And more recent work has begun to address this methodological limitation by measuring students' motivation after the anticipation of performance feedback rather than the actual receipt of it. But no studies have measured students' motivation after both the anticipation and receipt of performance feedback. Yet doing so is important not only because I expected it to further disentangle feedback form from valence, but also because it would allow for the motivational change or fluctuations within a single assessment experience to be captured. Second, the meta-analysis revealed that performance feedback effects have seldom been explored within high-stakes summative assessment contexts, yet it's very unlikely that conclusions would generalize from lower stakes or no stakes assessments to high-stakes summative assessment contexts. Third, and relatedly, the meta-analysis called for a more nuanced investigation of the consequences of pairing both grades and comments together. Notably, written comments appear to be very motivationally beneficial when delivered on their own in either no-stakes or low-stakes assessment context. However, delivering written comments on their own and therefore withholding graded information could seriously backfire on high-stakes assessments, especially given that in that case, assessment outcomes are still contributing to students' looming overall course grades. And then fourth and finally, despite arguments that grades are one of the most direct means of communicating information to students about their competence, and also one of the strongest predictors of student self-efficacy, the previous studies have very seldom explored how performance feedback influences competence beliefs in general and self-efficacy in particular. So inspired by and drawing from these 4 gaps in the extant literature, the dissertation study aimed to contribute a more nuanced understanding of how performance feedback influences students' motivation within a high-stakes summative assessment context specifically. And in exploring this question, the the primary study also aimed to investigate whether the feedback form and stage interacted with each other in order to ultimately influence students' motivation. And the study was guided by 3 theories of motivation that all make important predictions for how performance feedback should influence it. Where specifically, drawing from these 3 theories, the study investigated how different forms of performance feedback influence students' self-efficacy or their perceptions of if they can successfully complete a given task, their goal orientations, and their intrinsic motivation or their desire to engage in an academic task for its own sake. And to conduct this study, I recruited 161 students from a private all-female secondary school. They were in 7th, 8th, or 9th grade, and they were in one of 13 different math or science classes with one of 8 different teachers. And of course, some of these sample characteristics contextualize the study and its findings in important ways, which I'll discuss later. A cluster randomized experimental design was used where students were randomly assigned by their math or science class to one of the following 4 conditions. Students in the grades condition were told that they should expect to receive numeric grades on their assessment. Students in the comments condition were told that they should expect to receive brief written evaluative comments on their upcoming assessment. Students in the grades and comments condition were told that they should expect to receive both of these forms of feedback on their upcoming assessment, and students in the no feedback condition were told that they should expect to receive no feedback at all on their upcoming assessment. In all of these cases, it was the teachers who conveyed this information with me present for each of the manipulations. And in order to ensure that it was done in a standardized way, they read a script to convey this information that I had developed and we had discussed ahead of time. And it's also critical to note, in this study, regardless of the experimental condition, students believed that their assessment would count towards their course grade the way a typical in-class, high-stakes summative assessment would. And the procedure for this study was as follows. At baseline, in addition to collecting demographic information, students' course-specific self-efficacy, goal orientations, and intrinsic motivation were measured. Then, several days later, the performance feedback manipulation was delivered in the way that I just described, and immediately afterwards, students again reported on their motivation in order to capture these constructs immediately after the anticipation of feedback, but prior to the receipt of it. Then students, several days later, completed an assessment for which the performance feedback would be manipulated, which I refer to as the target assessment. Immediately after they did so, they completed one calibration item where they reported how well or poorly they thought they had performed on the assessment so that it could be accounted for in analyses later. And then finally, about a week later, teachers returned the assessments to students with the assigned feedback or lack thereof, in the case of the no feedback condition, included on those assessments. Students then had a few minutes to review their assessments and the feedback or lack thereof included on it, and then for a final time, they reported on their motivation. And then after that, of course, they were thoroughly debriefed and the study was concluded. A couple of notes about the assessment itself. First, in order to maximize the ecological validity of this study, all assessments were teacher designed, and they were naturally occurring assessments in the class. Also, although the content of the assessments inevitably had to vary somewhat based on the specific class and grade level, they were kept as standardized as possible or consistent between the different classes. And one way that where this was accomplished was all of the assessments were quite high stakes in nature, with the assessments counting towards an average of 20 to 30% of the student's course grade in that given term of the academic year. All of the grades that were delivered were criterion referenced, meaning they were determined relative to an absolute standard. And all of the comments were task-focused, or they focused on specific aspects of the student's performance on that particular assessment. And in order to ensure that the feedback matched these characteristics, I met one-on-one to give very detailed instructions. They also received detailed written instructions, and then teachers also followed up with questions as they emerged, as they were actually providing these assigned forms of feedback on the assessments themselves. And in order to measure the change in motivation from anticipation to receipt of the feedback, and in order to account for the clustered nature of the data, a 3-level multi-level modeling approach to data analysis was used, where time points were nested within students and students were nested within their classes. The 3 key variables included in all analyses were feedback condition, feedback stage, and their interaction. And in addition to those 3 key variables, students' reports of their calibration and their baseline motivation were included as covariates. So, what was actually found? Well, results presented a complex yet informative picture of how and when performance feedback ultimately influences students' motivation. And a main hypothesis of this study was that the motivational impact of performance feedback would be moderated by the feedback stage. And this hypothesis was supported across nearly all motivation outcomes. However, the specific nature of the interaction often diverged from hypotheses, which is what I'm going to discuss next. For example, with regard to self-efficacy, despite predictions that comments would lead to the most adaptive self-efficacy outcomes, it was actually only students in the grades and comments condition who experienced any kind of a change in their self-efficacy. And unexpectedly, they actually reported a significant decline in their self-efficacy upon receiving their feedback compared to when it was anticipated. In terms of students' performance approach goal orientations, or their reported desire to demonstrate their competence in their math or science class, also unexpectedly, it was students in the 2 conditions that did not involve grades, namely those who received and anticipated comments and those in the no feedback condition that experienced a significant change in their performance approach goal orientation, and they actually reported a significant increase in this outcome upon receipt of their feedback. In terms of students' reports of their mastery goal orientations or their desire to deeply learn the material in their math or science class, partially consistent with expectations, it was students in the grades and comments condition who experienced a significant increase in this motivational outcome upon the receipt of their feedback compared to the anticipation of it. And finally, with regard to students' intrinsic motivation, partially consistent with hypotheses, it was students in the 2 comments conditions, namely students who received either comments on their own or grades and comments together that experienced a significant increase in their intrinsic motivation upon the receipt of these 2 forms of feedback. And completely unexpectedly, and surprisingly, no feedback conditions, no students experienced a significant change at all in their performance avoidance goal orientations or their desire to avoid appearing incompetent in their math or science class. What conclusions can be drawn from this work? Something that I think is kind of cool about this study is actually more questions than answers emerged, but even still, some really important yet still tentative conclusions and implications can be drawn from this work as well. Where first, and put simply, The feedback stage really seems to matter, with motivational fluctuations from anticipation to receipt of feedback being the most robust finding across analyses within this study. And quite often, those motivational changes or fluctuations depended on the specific feedback condition. So one methodological implication that emerges from this work is that future performance feedback studies should try to measure motivation multiple times in order to fully capture the dynamic nature of this construct. Second, it's important to highlight that in contrast to the findings that were identified in the meta-analysis, it was students who received comments and grades together who overall experienced the most adaptive motivational or favorable motivational outcomes. And two implications emerge from this. First, it really seems to be worth the extra time on educators' parts to supplement graded feedback with written comments, even within a high-stakes summative assessment context. And also, these findings really point to the critical importance of considering the broader assessment context when trying to decide what forms of feedback might be the most motivationally optimal for students to receive. And finally, though, it's important to note that students in the grades and comments condition did not experience uniformly positive outcomes. They also experienced a significant decline in their self-efficacy, which points to two possibilities. On the one hand, it's possible that students' decline in self-efficacy signaled that they were overwhelmed by the sheer amount of feedback they may have received, which presents the possibility that maybe there is such a thing as too much feedback. On the other hand, though, it's possible that prior to receiving this grade and comment feedback, students' perceptions of their current level of understanding might have been inflated a little bit. So maybe this decline in self-efficacy instead reflected just more accurate perceptions about their current level of understanding. And I think that both of these possibilities are really important to explore in future work. And then finally, of course, these promising conclusions and implications that emerge from them need to be interpreted in light of several notable caveats, where first, the sample consisted entirely of girls, and especially in light of work that has identified gender differences in the way that male versus female students perceive and interpret the feedback that's delivered to them, it's really unclear the extent to which these findings would generalize to a male population. So that should be certainly addressed in future work. Another critical thing to note about this particular sample is that the study was conducted within an academically selective school. So what is probably understood or what was identified in this study is how students may respond to performance feedback when they typically perform quite well. What is not known from this study is how performance feedback may have operated within a more academically at-risk or academically heterogeneous student population. And I would say that this is perhaps the most essential direction for future work to address. And then finally, due to limited performance information, both in terms of their prior performance and current performance, this novel methodological paradigm that was used failed to disentangle feedback form from valence. But one thing, upon further reflection of these findings, that I am recommending to myself and perhaps to others as well, is to reconceptualize the idea of feedback valence. And rather than attempting to disentangle feedback form from valence, I think that it would be much more informative in future work to consider feedback valence as a moderator, specifically by asking questions like, how does the motivational impact of performance feedback depend on how well or how poorly the student is performing on the given assessment? And with that, I will thank you all so much for attending this talk and for your attention.